The invasion of Peleliu in September 1944 began with an air of unwarranted confidence among the invading force. It was widely believed by high command that the island would be secured in just 3 days, a swift victory that would clear the way for further Pacific operations. The initial reports from aerial reconnaissance described the island as a standard coral atoll with a small central rise. Marines joked on the transport ships about getting back to Pearl Harbor for a cold beer before the week was out. They expected the typical beach assault, followed by a relatively easy sweep inland to mop up the remaining defenders. The pre-invasion bombardment by the Navy was one of the most intense of the entire Pacific War, a veritable steel storm meant to sterilize the beaches and cripple the Japanese defenses entirely. When the landing craft finally scraped onto the white coral sands, the beaches initially seemed to confirm the optimistic predictions. The surf was moderate, and the landing itself was conducted with the usual marine efficiency and disciplined movement. However, the Marines' collective sense of foreboding grew immediately upon looking past the narrow stretch of beach. They were instantly confronted by the bizarre and wholly unexpected geological reality of Peleliu. The terrain was not the gentle, tropical landscape they had seen on other islands, nor was it the relatively smooth volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. Instead, immense, jagged, upthrust formations of ancient limestone coral dominated the skyline, rising like the teeth of some prehistoric beast. These bizarre formations were not just obstacles, they were a cruel, alien architecture of warfare itself. One Marine remembered simply stopping and whispering to his comrade, "This ain't like no goddamn place on Earth." The coral was so sharp it cut through boots, shredded uniforms, and offered no purchase for men scrambling to find cover from the suddenly erupting Japanese fire. The initial view of the Umurbrogol mountain ridge, a chaotic, unnavigable mass of broken rock, immediately dashed any hope of a quick and clean fight. The sheer scale of the rock fortress, a tangled, impossible maze of razor-sharp pinnacles and hidden sinkholes, told them everything they needed to know about the weeks ahead. The first hours of the battle were a devastating education in the new reality of island fighting. The Marines quickly understood that the pre-landing bombardment, which they had been told was devastating, had been almost entirely ineffective against the coral's formidable density. One sergeant, watching a shell explode against a ridge, reportedly yelled, "They didn't even scratch the paint on the damn place." The Japanese had brilliantly integrated their defenses into the natural rock, creating a complex, interlocking system of caves and pillboxes that naval gunfire simply could not penetrate. The flat beaches were quickly saturated by fire from concealed positions in the limestone cliffs overlooking the landings. Instead of fighting across open ground, the Marines were immediately forced into a vertical, grinding battle against a fortress carved by millennia of geological pressure. The men spoke of the terrain in terms of disbelief and deep, frustrated anger directed at the intelligence officers who had so grossly misjudged the task. They had prepared for a typical island defense, but they were met with a landscape of concrete and stone hardened by nature. Marine Private First Class Eugene B. Sledge would later write extensively about the sheer shock of confronting this unyielding, oppressive geology. He described the Umurbrogol as the worst thing I ever saw in my life, a testament to the emotional impact of the ridge's hostile appearance. The sharp coral not only slowed their advance but actively disabled their heavy equipment. Tank tracks were ripped to shreds by the razor-edge rock, rendering their armored support tragically immobile and exposed. Every forward step became an exhausting ordeal, a deliberate physical struggle against the environment before they even engaged the enemy. The terrain dictated the entire battle, turning squad movements into slow, painful climbs and advances into cautious, meter-by-meter efforts. The Marines realized with stark clarity that their training, honed for conventional assaults, was woefully inadequate for this subterranean, vertical style of combat. The initial feeling of being able to conquer anything quickly gave way to a cold, sinking sensation of being hopelessly entrapped by the very ground they stood upon. Beyond the physical obstacle of the coral, the Marines were instantly beset by the crushing, debilitating heat. Peleliu was situated just 7 degrees north of the equator, and the September sun beat down with ferocious intensity. The white coral sand and the exposed gray rock acted like a giant oven, reflecting and radiating the heat back onto the men trapped in the open. The air temperature was extreme, but the reflected heat from the rock surfaces often reached over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines quickly discarded unnecessary gear, but even basic equipment felt like an unbearable weight under the relentless sun. They began to sweat immediately and profusely, losing vital salts and water at an alarming, unsustainable rate. The heat was more than an inconvenience, it became a pervasive, insidious form of psychological torture that broke men before the enemy fire even found them. One veteran described the island as a goddamn blast furnace, a perfect description of the constant, unyielding atmospheric pressure. Hydration became the single most critical factor, yet water rationing was tragically instituted almost immediately due to logistical errors and the unexpected length of the initial engagement. The standard 2 canteens per man quickly proved inadequate, and the lack of potable water became an emergency crisis for the assault waves. Men spoke openly of the agonizing, wretched thirst, a constant, burning distraction that made clear thinking and coordinated action almost impossible. Some Marines were driven to desperation, drinking battery acid-contaminated water from destroyed equipment or even trying to collect the metallic, dusty condensation from the insides of the ruined cave entrances. The extreme environment caused an alarming rate of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, sidelining hundreds of men who were otherwise uninjured by the Japanese. Many were seen staggering, vomiting, or simply collapsing under the physical load, their bodies unable to regulate the punishing core temperature increase. The heat and the terrain combined to form a symbiotic enemy, ensuring that the Marines never had a moment of physical or mental respite. The collective saying was simple and stark: we fought the rock, and we fought the sun, and the Japs were just the one shooting at us. The Marines quickly realized that the Japanese defensive strategy was entirely predicated on the island's unique geology. General Kunio Nakagawa had ordered his men to abandon the suicidal beach defense typical of earlier Pacific campaigns and instead create a fortress from the Umurbrogol's natural caves and fissures. The Marines were now facing an enemy that was literally living and fighting within the rock itself. The Japanese transformed the coral landscape into a honeycomb of interconnected tunnels, firing positions, and supply depots. Marines described the feeling of fighting an enemy that could simply materialize from a hole in the ground, fire a devastating burst, and then vanish without a trace. The defensive positions were cleverly sited to provide interlocking fields of fire across the approaches to the ridges. One Marine remarked that it was like walking into a box trap made of stone, where every direction was covered by an unseen gun. The depth of the Japanese positions was perhaps the most unsettling discovery. Some cave networks ran hundreds of feet deep, offering perfect protection from all but a direct hit from the heaviest munitions. The only way to eliminate these positions was an agonizing, dangerous, close-quarters battle, involving flamethrowers and satchel charges. Marines tasked with clearing the caves spoke of the terrifying silence before the storm, the anticipation of an invisible enemy lurking just feet away. The claustrophobia of approaching a dark, jagged cave entrance was compounded by the knowledge that the terrain prevented any effective suppressive fire. The sheer unpredictability of the attack vectors created immense stress, as men could be shot from above, below, or behind without ever seeing their assailant. The Japanese had transformed Peleliu into a three-dimensional battlefield, turning a simple advance into a deadly, multi-layered problem. The Marines' frustration was palpable, rooted in the constant, gnawing feeling that they were fighting a ghost entrenched within an unbreakable shield of rock. This terrain was, in effect, a massive, unyielding bunker, and the Marines were left with the desperate, slow task of digging out every single enemy soldier by hand. The water crisis on Peleliu became an indelible memory, often overshadowing even the intensity of the combat itself. The initial assault troops were issued 2 canteens of water, a standard allotment that assumed a quick, successful engagement. This small quantity proved tragically insufficient in the brutal heat of the coral ridges, often being fully consumed within the first few hours of fighting. Compounding the problem, the seawater conversion units landed on the beach were quickly destroyed by Japanese shelling. The supply lines were constantly hampered by the impassable terrain and the unrelenting enemy mortar fire directed at the landing zones. The desperate Marines began talking about water as if it were pure gold, with men risking their lives just to find a trickle or a discarded, half-empty canteen. One Marine officer was quoted as saying, "You could sell your soul for a sip of clean water in that place." The thirst was not just an irritant, it was a physical malady that caused delirium, cracked lips, and severe muscle cramping. The heat caused the sweat to evaporate almost instantly, leaving a crust of white salt on their uniforms and faces. This forced dehydration contributed heavily to the massive number of heat casualties, weakening the fighting force even as the tactical battle raged on. The official Marine history noted that the battle became a fight against heat and thirst as much as against the Japanese. The constant, burning sensation in their throats and mouths made it impossible to rest or truly recover from the physical strain of climbing the sharp coral. When supply finally did get through, the water was often fouled, contaminated by oil or chemicals from ruptured storage drums, yet the Marines drank it anyway in their sheer desperation. The emotional and psychological toll of this basic necessity being denied was profound, turning a tactical operation into a brutal, elemental struggle for survival. The memory of the thirst, the sight of a fellow Marine succumbing to heat stroke, defined the early days of the Peleliu experience for every man who survived. The Umurbrogol mountain mass, which dominated the center of Peleliu, was the epicenter of the Marines' worst nightmares. It was not a single peak but a jagged, 3-mile-long spine of ancient, eroded coral limestone, riddled with subterranean passages. Marines referred to it simply as the Mountain or Bloody Nose Ridge, a title earned through the sheer carnage inflicted there. The terrain here was completely unsuited for conventional infantry assault or the use of heavy armor. Every ridge, every pinnacle, and every deep crevice was a potential firing point or a hiding place for a camouflaged Japanese sniper. The rock itself was a dark, treacherous material that crumbled under explosive force but was incredibly resilient to direct fire. The interlocking nature of the fire meant that an advance on one ridge would immediately expose the attacking force to machine gun fire from 2 adjacent ridges. Marines traversing the ridge lines often had to crawl on their bellies, their movement restricted to a deadly, snail-like pace. The jagged edges of the coral were constantly cutting into the men, causing minor but debilitating injuries that bled freely in the heat and became easily infected. The sound of ricocheting bullets off the dense rock was a constant, terrifying symphony that amplified the sense of danger and entrapment. One Marine famously described the Umurbrogol as the absolute end of the world, a desolate, infernal landscape designed to kill. The task of clearing the mountain devolved into individual, small unit battles fought with extreme close-quarters savagery. The Marines were forced to become specialists in demolitions, using flamethrowers to deny the enemy oxygen and satchel charges to blast cave entrances shut. The entire battle became a protracted siege of a natural fortress, proving that the High Command's 3-day estimate was ludicrously optimistic. The sheer verticality and complexity of the terrain guaranteed that the fight would be a protracted, soul-crushing exercise in attrition. One of the most disheartening realizations for the Marines was the impotence of their massive artillery support against the Coral Fortress. The immense firepower of the naval fleet and the ground-based artillery had been the decisive factor in many previous island battles. On Peleliu, however, the thick, densely packed limestone absorbed the concussive force of the shells with almost casual indifference. Marines watched with frustration as high-explosive rounds that should have leveled an emplacement simply pulverized the surface coral into a fine dust. The core enemy positions, deep within the caves and reinforced tunnels, remained completely untouched by the barrage. The lack of effectiveness against the main defensive structure was a crucial blow to morale and a catastrophic tactical problem. The Marines relied on artillery to soften targets, to suppress enemy fire, and to provide cover for their movements. Now, they were forced to advance against a fixed, protected enemy with almost no supporting fire that could reach the target. This meant the burden of eliminating the enemy fell entirely upon the small, individual infantry units, often with nothing more than their personal weapons and specialized close combat tools. The Japanese defenders, safe inside their rocky sanctuaries, were able to wait out the bombardments with minimal casualties. They would then emerge immediately after the shelling ceased to pour devastating fire onto the advancing Marine lines. The men in the foxholes began to develop a cynical attitude toward the shelling, recognizing its purely psychological effect rather than its physical power. This forced the Marines to adopt the painful, slow strategy of buttoning up the cave entrances with direct fire and then eliminating the occupants with white phosphorus and gasoline. The rock itself was the ultimate shield, proving superior to the best ordnance the U.S. military could throw at it. The Marines understood that their powerful doctrine of overwhelming fire superiority had met its immovable object in the island's peculiar terrain. The fight for Razorback Ridge, a particularly cruel and narrow feature of the Umurbrogol, became synonymous with the desperate brutality of the Peleliu terrain. The ridge was essentially a knife-edge spine of coral, barely wide enough for a man to crawl across in some places, with sheer drops on either side. It was heavily fortified with machine gun nests and interconnected pillboxes that allowed the Japanese to cover the entire length of the crest. Marines attempting to advance along this feature were constantly exposed, making them easy targets for the enemy's perfectly sighted weapons. They could neither maneuver nor find adequate cover on the smooth, precarious summit of the formation. The only way forward was a slow, painful crawl, often under continuous fire from both the front and the flanks. The Marines' descriptions of this ridge were colored by terror and physical anguish, detailing the feeling of being utterly helpless on the exposed rock. The ground was so sharp that merely resting on it caused painful abrasions, and moving at all was an exercise in controlled suffering. The fight devolved into a series of individual duels, where men would rush forward a few feet at a time, seeking minimal protection behind a rock fragment. The extreme stress of fighting on such exposed, elevated ground led to a significant number of combat fatigue cases among the men. They faced the grim choice of remaining pinned down under fire or risking certain death by advancing into the open. Razorback Ridge was a tactical meat grinder, symbolizing the terrain's ability to maximize casualties with minimal effort from the defenders. The ridge was not won by a sweeping charge but by the agonizing, methodical work of flamethrower teams and engineers clearing the Japanese positions one at a time. The Marines who survived the fight for Razorback carried indelible memories of the blood and severed limbs that marked every inch of that deadly spine. The sheer absurdity and brutality of the Peleliu terrain provoked a verbal outpouring of frustration and dark humor from the Marines. Their language became a crucial psychological outlet, filled with profanity that attempted to capture the raw, impossible reality of their situation. They used terms for the coral that were unprintable, inventing new descriptors for the razor-sharp rock that constantly tore at their flesh. The Umurbrogol was called every variation of hell and the devil's playground, demonstrating the men's belief that they were fighting in a truly infernal environment. Officers and enlisted men alike cursed the intelligence failures that had led them to believe the battle would be easy. Their words were a form of collective coping mechanism, a way to acknowledge the madness of fighting in a place where the sun was their enemy and the ground actively tried to kill them. One of the most repeated and enduring quotes attributed to the Marines was a simple, defeated exclamation, "We didn't land, we were shipwrecked." This phrase perfectly captured the feeling of being marooned on a hostile, alien planet, utterly unprepared for the immediate, existential threat of the landscape. Another common expression of their exhaustion was the simple, weary statement, "This is a Marine killer." The constant use of profanity and colorful language served to build a grim camaraderie among the men who shared this unique, terrible experience. It was the language of men pushed beyond the breaking point, a lexicon born of thirst, pain, and the frustrating inability to use their superior firepower effectively. These raw, unfiltered remarks became the unofficial history of the battle, telling the true story of the Marines' emotional and physical confrontation with Peleliu. The words they spoke to each other in the foxholes were far more accurate than any official communique about the nature of the struggle. The terrain of Peleliu, particularly the contorted coral ridges, began to take a heavy toll on the mental state of the fighting men. The constant stress of the invisible enemy, combined with the extreme heat and dehydration, created an environment ripe for psychological trauma. Marines often describe the landscape as surreal or lunar, a place so alien that it distorted their perception of reality. The jagged, pockmarked coral, perpetually coated in a film of red dust, seemed to defy any logical or familiar geological structure. The endless caves and holes in the ground made every shadow a potential threat and every step a possible fall into a sniper's field of fire. The sheer unyielding nature of the rock, refusing to be breached by bombs or artillery, created a pervasive sense of futility. The men's eyes became weary from constantly scanning the broken, confusing terrain for any sign of movement or a flash of muzzle fire. Many Marines began to suffer from vivid hallucinations brought on by the combination of heat stroke and sleep deprivation. The landscape itself became an object of fear and hatred, personified as a malicious entity actively working in concert with the Japanese. The endless, grinding nature of the fight, clearing cave after cave, week after week, led to an alarming rise in what was then termed combat fatigue. The Marines were trapped in a geological labyrinth, with no discernible front lines or safe rear areas, which only amplified the mental strain. The official records later noted that the mental breakdown rate was disproportionately high compared to other Pacific campaigns. The men were fighting a battle that seemed to have no end, against an enemy that never surrendered, in a place that seemed determined to break them physically and mentally. The coral was the constant, silent witness to the madness, its bizarre formations the perfect stage for the unfolding human tragedy. The Battle of Peleliu quickly became a stark lesson in the deadly consequences of underestimating both the enemy and the terrain. The Marines' initial assessment that the island would fall in days was based on a fundamental misreading of the Japanese defense plan and the geology. General Nakagawa's decision to fight a battle of attrition from protected positions was a tactical masterpiece for the defense. The intelligence officers had completely failed to grasp that the coral ridges were not hills but an impregnable, multi-level fortress. The Marines felt betrayed by the assurances of an easy campaign, their anger fueled by the mounting casualties and the protracted fighting. The battle forced an immediate and painful revision of American doctrine for assaulting heavily fortified positions. It taught the military that massive naval bombardment was useless against deeply entrenched coral and limestone defenses. The Marines learned that they could not rely on air power or heavy artillery to do the job. It had to be done by men with flamethrowers and satchel charges at close range. This forced adaptation led to a significant increase in the use of specialized engineering and demolition teams to breach the cave systems. The Marines who endured Peleliu carried a deep, abiding respect for the Japanese strategy, even as they fought against it. They understood that the terrain had been the Japanese commander's best ally, turning a small island into a massive, defensible bunker. The enduring legacy of the Marines' experience was the realization that in the Pacific, terrain was often the most formidable combatant of all. The cost of this lesson was high, measured in thousands of casualties and weeks of unforeseen, brutal fighting that ultimately served little strategic purpose. The battle eventually concluded, not with a decisive breakthrough, but with the methodical, agonizing extermination of the last pockets of resistance. The final Marine sentiments were not of triumph but of profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a quiet pride in their sheer endurance. They had conquered a terrain that one observer described as not fit for human habitation, let alone for warfare. The Marines walked off Peleliu with a new, hardened understanding of what was possible to withstand, both physically and spiritually. Their unspoken testament was etched into the faces of the survivors, men who had faced the furnace heat and the razor coral and somehow lived. The words they eventually spoke, often years later, focused less on the enemy and more on the island itself, the true antagonist. Veterans spoke of the coral with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect for its ability to defy their might. The legacy of Peleliu for the Marines was the absolute certainty that they could endure the worst conditions the Earth could offer. The fight proved the unmatched necessity of small unit improvisation and the courage required to advance against an unseen foe protected by stone. The island stands today as a silent, natural monument to the grit of the Marines who fought there, the jagged ridges still bearing the scars of that brutal confrontation. The most powerful statements about Peleliu's terrain were not shouted in battle but whispered in the quiet reflections of the men who survived it. They simply stated that they had faced the impossible and, by sheer force of will, had prevailed over the rock, the sun, and the unseen enemy within.